The Tryx Panorama SE is a popular all-in-one cooler for PC builders thanks to that large display that you can see mounted here in that waterfall design, allowing you to display a number of different graphics on it and have temperature readouts and system metrics at a glance easily viewable within your machine. It's really easy to set up, and you can set it up with the display in a couple of different directions, giving you options on how to install it. Here I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with the cooler after I installed it in a couple of different ways in this Tryx Luca case, mounting it on the side as an intake radiator and on the top as an exhaust rad, using Corsair fans on it and also the pre-installed fans in a couple of different setups. So I'm going to show you how it performed under load with thermal testing later on in the video, but also talk to you about the overall setup experience, which for the most part is really straightforward and easy to do. The Panorama SE 360 ARGB comes with a number of accessories in the box, but these actually aren't overwhelming. The fans are also pre-installed and wired up ready to go, so it's pretty straightforward. You have a number of different accessories, but it's easy to install directly onto an Intel motherboard, as you can see here, or an AMD motherboard with relative ease, and then to wire things up in a very straightforward way. This all-in-one cooler is designed to connect to the motherboard directly without a controller, with the pump itself connecting to the AIO pump header. Then you have this additional cable which connects to the fans and includes a 5V RGB connection, both male and female, meaning that you can actually chain in other ARGB fans into the system really easily. And then that connects to the motherboard and allows you to plug into the CPU fan header and to the 5V RGB header, giving your motherboard and your motherboard software control over the RGB lighting and the fan speed really easily. So it's got a very straightforward setup, no matter whether you're using Intel or AMD, standard motherboards or rear connect motherboards. The process for installing and wiring everything in is really straightforward and pretty hassle-free, assuming of course that you have 5V RGB connections on your motherboard and easy access to those, and enough of them to be able to plug these and other things that you might have in your system in with ease, which you should do on most modern motherboards, but it is worth checking. And then you can end up with a pretty good system that's easy to set up. There are a few other things that are worth knowing, so I've done an in-depth build guide on this cooler that I'll link to in the description, which goes into a lot more depth on it and how to get it set up and working properly. But you can also pair it up with other fans, as I mentioned, as long as they're ARGB fans. You can connect up that 5V connection to a chain of the RGB connectors, for example with these Corsair RS fans. The way that works is simply taking the male connector from the chain of connections on the fans on the radiator and plugging it into a female connector on a 5V RGB connection on daisy chained fans on the Corsair fans in this instance, meaning that you can sync up the fan lighting really easily if you've got those sorts of fans in your case, which makes it very straightforward in terms of the RGB. So you can see there's lots of connectivity that makes it easy. Now they are set up as exhaust fans as standard, with them wired in a way where basically if you wanted to install it straight out of the box, you'd have to install it like this with the tubes on the left hand side, and so that the fan cables will be facing towards the back of the radiator. This makes it fairly straightforward to do that, but obviously you do need to account for certain things like whether in your case you're planning on putting a rear exhaust fan in and whether the tubes will then interfere with that, how it will look in terms of the positioning of it. You also have a choice in which side you mount the tubes on, and this will have an impact on how you mount the screen. You can see with the tubes on the right hand side of the pump head near the RAM, you can only really put the screen on in that waterfall position with the screen running from the top or to the front in that direction rather than sideways on. So you have to consider this during the build process, perhaps putting the tubes on the bottom as an alternative so you can see it like that, and then you get to mount the screen this way. Now I would actually recommend mounting it so the screen's in this position sideways on. It gives you more options in the software. You're limited in the number of display options that you can have in that waterfall position. I'll show you what I mean in a minute in the software, but unfortunately it's better this way. Not necessarily a problem though. In terms of side mounting the radiator, that's also possible. As you can see, I've swapped out the fans now for Corsair's reverse rotor LX IQ Link fans, and side mounting the radiator with the tubes at the top of the case, but the pump itself is not the highest point, so it's not necessarily a concern. But again, you have to consider the length of the tubes, where they're going to position on the block, how it's going to stretch, and the impact that's going to have on how you're going to mount the display once you get that installed as well. So it's worth sort of planning these things out, get an idea of how it's going to look in your build before you do it. Now, in case you're curious, you could also mount it with the tubes at the bottom of the radiator. Again, the pump isn't the highest point here. The top of the rad is, so it's not an issue in this position. But this is going to depend on the case, because you can see in this one, the tubes are probably long enough, but they might interfere with the graphics card. And it depends very much on your case whether this will work or not, depending on how much distance there is from the side or from the front to the CPU mounting point. So I'd suggest testing this out for yourself in your build before you decide where you're going to mount it. But I personally prefer to put it at the top. It makes life a lot easier in terms of setting it up. And you can see this is very flexible in terms of how you mount it and where you position it. It just, in the end of the day, is down to aesthetics on both the tubes and the screen and how that's going to work. But in terms of actually mounting it both to Intel and AMD builds, is very straightforward in terms of the mounting bracket and the initial setup as well. So it makes it very easy there. So for AMD, all you have to do is remove the pre-installed brackets, then install these black ones in their place using the screws that actually come with your motherboard. And then you just mount the cooler to that, and then the radiator to the case with the screws that are included there. And then the setup's pretty much done with the simple wiring that I showed you earlier on. Now it comes with additional thermal grease included in the box. So you get a tube of thermal paste that you can use in future if you ever need to put extra on, or if you damage the thermal paste during the installation process, so you can then put more on. And I did this for the testing, during the thermal testing, the performance you'll see later. But it does actually come with pre-applied thermal paste on the pump itself straight out of the box. So when you remove the plastic cap, you'll see there's thermal paste there. You could just get away with using that just perfectly fine. Just during the testing, I managed to take that off and damage it, obviously, so I had to replace it and update it. But it fits really easily. Just the mounting bracket just slips over the top. There's no need to replace the bracketing on the pump either, so this is very straightforward for either Intel or AMD. The wiring and setup of it is a breeze, which is definitely one of the highlights. Then has little springs included in the box and some screws that you need to tighten up to fix it into place, but otherwise it's very easy to do, which is definitely nice. In terms of screen setup, you can put it into this waterfall mode as I've shown, but what I found is this is not the optimum position to do this in, because unfortunately in the software you'll find that there are a number of different presets, so screen displays that you can go between, but the majority of them are designed for it in that landscape mode. So you're much better off having it in this position where you get to see the different animations that they've set up for it working in a logical way. Now, in the software, you can go into the settings and you can tell it that you're in waterfall mode. So you can let it know that you put it in that other position, but it just doesn't seem to work as well, at least with the default presets of what's available in there to go through. So there are a number of different ones that you can choose through, and you can also choose from a number of different other things that you can apply to it in terms of temperature readouts and stuff like that. But you can see, you can go through these settings here and select from a number of them, some of which you've seen on the screen. They're definitely nice and very striking, and the screen is obviously very bright and clear as well. It has some nice features on it. I have, however, found some issues where sometimes it wouldn't come on when I booted Windows, despite the fact that the program was set to launch when Windows launched. I found I had to manually open it before the display would then come on properly. And this happened a few times during my testing. I've also found that you can turn the GPU temperature and CPU temperature and other things on, but I also found that randomly that would end up in a weird place where I hadn't put it on the display and I had to go into the software and change it. Most of the time it works fine, but there are occasions where it's a bit frustrating in terms of the user experience. So I would recommend updating the firmware if you do get this and making sure you've got the latest software, obviously, because this might improve in future. Now for some thermal testing. This is top mounted as exhaust, and first of all I ran Cinebench 2024 and I got a score of 1141, which isn't amazing for the 9800X3D, but it does have the game boost turned on, and it is, as you can see, running a little bit hot, so it was averaging around 75 degrees. Now, I was playing Battlefield 6 at 4K with the graphics turned all the way up here, and I equally found that the CPU was getting in the high 70s on occasion, which is surprising because usually in other systems I've tested it will usually be in the high 60s instead, so it is a little bit hotter. Now I only have 4 intake fans in here, 3 side intakes and 1 bottom, so perhaps this is some of the impact on it. And the experience did vary from game to game. You can see Dirt Rally 2 here, for example, we're looking at 67 degrees C. But I was surprised how hot it was running both in the Cinebench test and in other games as well. Now, with it side mounted with intake, I found that I got a better score here. So I'm now getting 1196, so a marginally better score in Cinebench. And the temperatures are a little bit cooler than they were before. But generally speaking, this sort of setup usually is preferable, where you've got cold air being pulled through the radiator, cooling the CPU down by cooling that liquid down more. And I did find, as you can see with Battlefield 6, that on occasion it was now running a lot cooler, so the CPU is now just over 50 degrees instead of a 70 degree mark. So the experience is interesting here in that it did drop the temperature as I was expecting by side mounting it, but this also varied in other games as well. I want you to bear in mind with this that I've set the IQ Link fans from Corsair to quiet in both tests, so in both different builds of this case, and also I'm using a different motherboard, so I'll leave the specs of both builds in the description down below. But the idea here is to keep it quiet but still to see how well it performs in that setup, and so the temperatures aren't too bad from that. But as I said, with other 360mm coolers I've tested recently, I just found that this CPU was running cooler than this. So this is a little bit hot, but it could be down to the case, so your experience may vary from case to case as well. You might see a different result there. But you can see in the finals here, again running at 4K, and I'm recording obviously with OBS on this system as well, getting 70 degrees C on the CPU here. And then this is the precinct. So we've got a mix of casual games and slightly more intense ones, testing out on a variety of different ones, but similar sort of experience. The good news is I've not noticed any issues with the cooler being loud. Not had any problems, even when it had the standard fans on it, in terms of it being noisy. It performs well in that regard. It does look nice in terms of the RGB lighting from the standard fans and what's available on the screen. The screen is really vivid, got some good colors out of it. The different preset options are quite nice in terms of what you can have displaying behind it. You're kind of limited on what you can get in terms of the readouts on it, but otherwise, generally speaking, it's a pretty nice experience overall. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this useful. Stick around now to hear a sound test of what the cooler's like under load without me talking. And thanks very much for watching. Check out the links in the description to find out more, see the specs of the builds and related videos.
Yes!
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.